Reports also referred to an increase in military cooperation between the DPRK and the Russian Federation. The President of the Russian Federation confirmed that Russia had tested a new conventional medium-range missile called Oreshnik, recorded over 12,340 civilians killed and more than 27,836 civilians injured in Ukraine. Thank you very much, Mr. President. More than 1,000 days have passed since the Russian Federation's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, launched on 24th of February 2022, in violation of the UN Charter and of international law. Since then, hostilities across Ukraine have continued to escalate, exacerbating humanitarian needs. Since the last briefing to the Security Council on this topic on 31st of October 2024, we have continued to witness unacceptable levels of civilian death and injuries, as well as the systematic and deliberate targeting by Russian Federation of Ukraine's energy infrastructure. These large-scale attacks raise grave concerns for the welfare of civilians who are facing a winter of hardship and misery. Meanwhile, incidents of conflict-related sexual violence and other violations of human rights also remained a grave concern. All parties to any armed conflict have an obligation to respect and protect civilians and civilian objects, as well as to comply with applicable international law, including international humanitarian law, which prohibits, amongst others, indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks, and to support international efforts to investigate violations. Mr. President, transfers of arms and ammunition and the provision of other forms of military assistance to the armed forces of Ukraine have also continued. The transfers have reportedly included heavy conventional weapons such as battle tanks, armored combat vehicles, combat aircraft, helicopters, large caliber artillery systems, missile systems, and uncrewed combat aerial vehicles, as well as remotely operated munitions and small arms and light weapons and their ammunition. There have also been reports of states transferring or planning to transfer weapons such as uncrewed aerial vehicles, ballistic missiles and ammunition to the Russian armed forces, and that those weapons have been used and are likely to be used in Ukraine. Reports also referred to an increase in military cooperation between the DPRK and the Russian Federation. This includes reports of the DPRK having transferred military supplies such as ballistic missiles and artillery shells, as well as technical exchanges and DPRK troop deployment to the Kursk region of the Russian Federation. Although the United Nations is not in a position to verify or confirm any claims or reports made, the Secretary General issued a statement on 3rd of November, noting his concern about reports of troops from the DPRK being sent to the Russian Federation, including their possible deployment to the conflict zone. He said this would represent a very dangerous escalation of war in Ukraine. I reiterate that any transfer of weapons and ammunition must take place consistently with the applicable international legal framework, including relevant Security Council resolutions which, in certain instances, impose sanctions and restrictive measures on such transfers. Mr. President, the use of armed uncrewed aerial vehicles and missiles by the Russian Federation continues to cause civilian death and injuries, as well as damage to civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. On 21st of November, the President of the Russian Federation confirmed that Russia had tested a new conventional medium-range missile called Oreshnik. This followed the use of US and UK-provided long-range weapons by the armed forces of Ukraine against the territory of the Russian Federation, some of which reportedly resulted in damage to civilian objects. I urge all concerned to refrain from any steps that may lead to further spillover and intensification of the conflict, as well as any further harm to civilians. Indeed, between 24th February 2022 and 30th of November 2024, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR, recorded over 12,340 civilians killed and more than 27,836 civilians injured in Ukraine. The same office notes that 42% of casualties in Ukraine in November resulted from the use of long-range weapons launched by the Russian Federation, a significant increase from previous months. According to the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine verified data, aerial bombs killed 341 civilians and injured 1,803 from 1 January through 30 November 2024, a threefold increase in fatalities and a sixfold increase in injuries from aerial bombs compared to 2023. In addition, there have also been reports of a number of cross-border strikes using missiles and uncrewed aerial vehicles by Ukraine inside the Russian Federation, with some reportedly resulting in damage to civilian objects. Just like any other weapons or weapon systems, armed uncrewed aerial vehicles and missiles must not be used in a manner inconsistent with international humanitarian law. The use of explosive weapons in populated areas remains one of the most significant threats to civilians in armed conflict. Such use of these weapons is unacceptable in view of the well-documented pattern of civilian harm and the likelihood of indiscriminate effects. Reports of the use and transfer of cluster munitions remain deeply concerning due to the indiscriminate harm these weapons can cause and the widespread contamination they leave behind. Equally alarming are recent announcements regarding the transfers of non-persistent anti-personnel landmines. These explosive devices are prohibited under the Convention on the Prohibition of the Use, Stockpiling, Production, and Transfer of Anti-Personnel Mines and on their destructions. The universal participation in and the full implementation at all times and under any circumstances of the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention and the Convention on Cluster Munitions and Convention on Prohibitions or restrictions on the use of certain conventional weapons must remain a priority. I reiterate my call on all states to abide by their international humanitarian law obligations and to become parties as a matter of priority to disarmament treaties and comply with the obligations therein. Compliance with these obligations is crucial in preventing unnecessary suffering or superfluous injury to persons and in protecting civilians. I also reiterate the Secretary General's call for states to reduce the human cost of weapons, including by endorsing the political declaration on strengthening the protection of civilians from the humanitarian consequences arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, if they have not already done so, and establish mechanisms to mitigate harm to civilians. Mr. President, measures to prevent and mitigate the risk of diversion of weapons and ammunition are key for preventing further instability and insecurity in Ukraine, the region, and beyond. Such efforts by all parties involved in arms transfers will also be essential to post-conflict recovery. Universal participation in arms control treaties and instruments, along with their full and effective implementation, is key to preventing the diversion of conventional arms and regulating the international arms trade. This includes Arms Trade Treaty, the Firearms Protocol, the Program of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons and its International Tracing Instrument, and the Global Framework for Through-Life Conventional Ammunition Management. Mr. President, I reiterate Secretary General's call for just, lasting, and comprehensive peace in Ukraine, consistent with the UN Charter and in line with the relevant General Assembly resolutions. The United Nations will continue to stand ready to use our good offices and to support all meaningful efforts to this end. I thank you very much for your attention.
Don't miss out. Log on to oneindia.com for more updates.